right, so welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Cheyenne. I'm a nurse practitioner here at CapitalCare Developmental Pediatrics,
And I'm Erin. I'm another one of the nurse practitioners. And then we have Matt and April, who are two more of our nurse practitioners who are also joining us to help answer questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them in the chat function. And they will be posting some answers during the presentation using the chat. If you're on your phone and you can't see that, don't worry about it. At the end of the presentation, we will read some of the questions and answers out loud as well.
Okay. So today we're going to be discussing strategies for your picky eater. We'll be focusing on strategies to reduce picky eating, resistance to trying new foods, and making mealtime more pleasant for your family. We will be introducing a framework developed by nutritionist Ellen Satter, and Erin's going to be talking about that in depth. We want to mention that there are many ways to approaching picky eating. These strategies that we're discussing today can be effective for many children and families. You may be using different techniques with your feeding therapist, occupational therapist, or speech and language pathologist, and if they're working for your family, that's great. You might pick up a few additional strategies today, but we want to make sure that what's working for you and your child and is effective for your family, you're able to stick with. So just because you're doing something different, that doesn't mean it's wrong.
So we're going to start talking a little bit about what is picky eating. So many children describe their child as picky eater at some point during their development. So what does that mean? Some of the common concerns that we hear are children who only want to eat a limited variety of food, children who are really resistant to trying new things, kids who have very strong food likes and dislikes, and may have some emotional reactions, tantrums, and outbursts if you don't give them something that they want or if you are trying to convince them to try a new food. So why does this happen? It often starts for many kids as a typical developmental phase. So as our kids are getting often to around 2 years old, you start entering that phase where they say no to everything. They're trying to assert some control and be more independent. And often this comes out in the common parenting sort of power struggles around eating, sleeping, and toileting. So we're going to try to talk about decreasing some of those power struggles today. We also see it more commonly in the children that we follow in our developmental practice who may have some developmental differences. For instance, children who have difficulty communicating may have trouble telling you what they want or don't want, or what they like or don't like about something that you're giving them. They may have differences in the way the muscles in their tongue and mouth move that might make it difficult for them to eat different textures of foods. Some of the children we see have a very difficult time being flexible and trying new things. They don't like change, and so change in what they're being offered to eat is really hard. Some kids are also very overwhelmed by the sensory experience of eating. And some kids are so busy and distractible that they just have trouble sitting still at the table long enough to eat a whole meal.
I think it's important to mention that some children may have severe feeding difficulties that do require a more specialized intervention. This might include children with swallowing disorders, food allergies that really limit their diet, or children who are highly restrictive with regard to eating secondary to a developmental disability. If you're very worried about your child's nutritional status or growth, or if you've tried many of these behavioral strategies and things are not improving, it'll be important to speak to your medical or early intervention team. One diagnosis that you guys may have heard of is ARFID, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and we'll kind of discuss the difference between a typical picky eater, highly selective eater, and then this new diagnosis that you may have heard of.
So you know that you feel like your child is picky about their eating. So when is this a cause of concern? So a typical child who's going through some picky eating phase, typically if you write down every food that they will accept at least some of the time, or that they typically are okay with eating, they'll eat at least 30 different foods. They'll accept at least 1 or 2 foods from each food group. So they're eating some fruit or vegetable, some grains and starches, and some form of protein. And they're usually able to tolerate being around the food that they don't like as long as they're not asked to eat it. So it's okay if you cook something, if it's at the table, if their brother is eating it, they just don't want to eat it themselves. If you're seeing that your child, when you write down the foods that they're eating, if they're are less than 30, if they're in the 15 to 20 range for foods that they'll accept regularly, or if there's whole food groups that they're avoiding completely, or they're really having difficulty even with the food being on the table and they're gagging and having very strong reactions to it, that would be something to talk to your medical team or to your therapy providers about.
So Erin described what might be a highly selective eater. I'm going to talk briefly about avoidant restricted food intake disorder. It's not something that we're going to be covering today, but we do think it's important to just touch on this diagnosis. So this is a new diagnosis in the DSM-5, previously referred to as selective eating disorder. It has very specific diagnostic criteria that must be met in order to qualify for a diagnosis, and that would include significant weight loss or nutritional deficiency secondary to the high selectivity of eating. The child does not consume enough calories to grow and develop properly, and some individuals may be dependent on enteral feeding or oral nutritional supplements.
All right, so let's talk for just a minute about what our goals are when we're trying to feed our children, because sometimes we get so busy, caught up in the day-to-day of just getting something put on the table, meal after meal after meal, that we don't really think about what are our longer-term goals and what's the big picture. We also want to put this in a little context of where we are in the world right now. We're in the middle of a really difficult time during this pandemic. Families are under more stress. Routines are disrupted, kids may not be in school, parents may be working from home, and this creates kind of a feeling of anxiety and loss of control. You may see in yourself or in other adults around you that when you're feeling nervous about things, your appetite is lower, or you're home all day and you're bored and you're snacking all the time, or you're seeking out comfort foods to try to make yourself feel a little better. And that's typical. It's happening for all of us, and it's happening for our kids too. So we want to make sure we're trying to decrease the stress around eating. Right now, in the short term, we really want the goal just to be that your child is getting enough food, that they have energy to grow, to play, to learn, to be a child. And that's really food energy from any source in the short term. We also want to make mealtime a pleasant experience, because if children are feeling very stressed and parents are feeling stressed at the table, it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to feel safe and comfortable to try new foods and to enjoy mealtime. And we want to keep in mind the longer term goal, which is trying to raise what Ellen Satter refers to as a competent eater. So when your child is an adult, you would like them to be able to enjoy a variety of different foods. You'd like them to be able to try new foods in different situations, not feel stressed or worried about going to a dinner party or a restaurant or eating at school. And you want your child to have a healthy relationship with food so that they are able to eat the amount that they need for their body to be comfortable and to grow in whatever way is right for their body. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the specifics of what's involved in this framework developed by Ellen Satter. And the big take-home message is called the division of responsibility. And in a nutshell, what that means is you want to be very clear about what is the parent or caregiver's responsibility and what is the child's responsibility. And so the parent is going to be responsible for what foods are offered, where those foods can be eaten, and when the foods are eaten. And then the child is going to be completely responsible for how much food they eat and whether or not they eat a particular food at all. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about when food is offered, because I think that's important. Most of our kids thrive on routine and predictability, and so it's best, if possible, that you offer meals and snacks on a fairly set schedule so that kids know when to expect food is going to be offered again. The other most common issue we see, especially in our younger kids, where parents are worried that they're not eating enough or they're not taking in enough calories at mealtime, parents will start to offer them snacks frequently between meals in order to try to increase the number of calories they're eating per day. And actually that ends up backfiring, because then if the child is having milk and juice and snacks throughout the day, when they sit down at the table, they're not hungry. And if they're not hungry, they're going to be less willing to try new things. They're also going to have more difficult behavior. They're not going to want to sit still at the meal for as long if they're not feeling hungry. So we do recommend spacing out eating opportunities really by 2 to 3 hours, and between those times, only offering water. So that might be breakfast, a mid-morning snack, lunch, an afternoon snack, and dinner. And you can do what works for your family, but it is important to have some times when food is not being offered to the kids. When we're looking at where food is offered, if possible, it really works better if you can get kids to sit down and eat at a table with limited distractions, without TV or tablets or devices. And this is hard for all of us these days. But in the longer run, it does encourage better eating habits. Then we got to get to the important part, which is what foods are being offered. So when you're thinking about offering food, let's say at dinner time, we want to help you get out of the habit of being a short order cook and making something different for every family member. So what tends to work best is if, when you're planning for the meal, you include at least one food that each of your children will accept. And then you allow them to eat that food. So for some kids, that might be a kind of a plain starchy side, something like pasta or bread or rice. Maybe when you're starting this out, you're going to have a side dish of chicken nuggets, because that's something that you know kids will eat. But you want to try to keep the food the same for everybody and let each person decide how much they're going to eat. So now we're getting into the child's responsibility. They've got food in front of them, and they are going to choose whether or not they're going to eat that food. So this can be really hard, and it's hard especially if you feel like your kids eat best when you're encouraging them. Take one more bite, try some of this, you can do it. And that's a really hard habit to break. But in the long run, it's going to help your child feel less stressed about eating. If they sense that you are very invested in how much they eat at each meal, and it's really, you're living and dying on every bite of food that they eat, it creates a lot of pressure and stress. And in the long run, it really makes them more difficult for them to try new foods. So consider serving food family style and letting the children put some on their plate and letting them go back for seconds of something, and trying not to make it conditional. You can have more potatoes if you eat one more bite of peas. Try to just let them eat. And then also model the eating behavior. It's helpful if you can sit down and eat with them for at least some of the meals. Let them see you eat a variety of different foods. And then you're also distracted. You're eating your own food, and so maybe you're not commenting quite so much on what they're doing.
We thought it would be important and helpful to many families to see kind of the variety of foods that belong on a child's plate, portion sizes, and the healthy eating plate can be really helpful when determining portions and relative amounts of foods that should be on a good variety plate at mealtime. Okay. We're going to get into some more specific strategies for reducing picky eating. I think it's really important to revisit this idea that this age group is seeking autonomy and control, and this can lead to a lot of battles. What's more, mealtime can feel really unpredictable to children, which might be particularly hard for anxious or rigid kids. So what are some ways that we can give back control during mealtime, decrease anxiety around eating, and increase the likelihood that your child will try new foods? Erin touched on this earlier. It's important to offer at least one food that you know your child will eat at mealtime, and I think especially when introducing a new food. your child might require several introductions to a new food before they're willing to try it. And we're going to get into this a little bit more when we discuss something called food chaining. But there are different, a series of steps that you can introduce when you're introducing a new food to their diet. And avoid offering too many new foods at once. This can feel really overwhelming and intimidating. Using plate dividers or separate plates and bowls for kids who, and this is really common, I think, for any kid, even kids who are not necessarily picky eaters, but lots of kids don't want their foods to touch, right? I don't want this food to touch this food, or I don't want this new food to touch any of my preferred foods. And so offering a plate divider or putting the new foods on a separate bowl or on a separate plate can be really helpful. It can also make it easier to include some dipping sauces, which can also be a way to increase the likelihood that your child will try new foods. This is fun, it adds more flavor, it's a little bit more tactile, maybe it adds a different texture to the food that they're eating.
And it also adds some familiarity.
Yeah.
If you're dipping it in ketchup,
right.
It'll taste like ketchup.
It tastes like ketchup, but you tried that new food, right? And offering foods in fun ways, like on a special spoon or on a special plate, cutting it in different shapes. You can see on the side of this slide a Mrs. Pac-Man. That's pretty easy and quick. You don't have to get really elaborate and crazy with how you present foods. Get a couple cookie cutters from, Target or a crinkle cutter, and that can be a really fast way to make food a little bit more fun and exciting. And allowing alternative forms of sensory exploration. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we're talking about the sensory aspects of picky eating, but that can decrease fearfulness and the pressure to actually put the food in their mouth. So allowing them to touch or smell the food rather than having to eat it the first time they're approaching it. And these alternative forms of sensory exploration can help increase their familiarity with that food and make it more likely for them to actually try and eat it later on. Going back to control, kids are so control-seeking, especially now that so many things are out of their control. And so involving them in the preparation and serving of food, if they have the motor skills to do so, is another way of giving them back some of that control. I think setting consistent routines with meals and snack times, and that might not just be the time and the location, but also the expectations around what mealtime looks like, the preparation that goes into it, who's sitting at the table, how do we set the table. Minimizing distractions during mealtime is also very important. Turn off the TV in the background, reduce, phones and tablets at the table, and set that example for your children too. Particularly for distractible eaters, reducing distractions at mealtime is important. But for picky eaters, even not necessarily distractible ones, having the tablet or the TV on in the background can also be kind of an escape, right? And might be a way that they get pulled away from the food that's intimidating them, and it might make them less likely to try the new food. I also think it's important to note that while we're eating, we are learning to identify when we're full, and that's a really important skill to learn long term, right? And so if we have distractions at the table, we're not practicing that skill. We're not learning that skill. So that's another reason to decrease distractions at mealtime.
And that's one of the main tenets in this framework as well, is thinking that most kids are really born as being intuitive eaters who eat when they're hungry and stop when they're full. Even if their full point seems earlier than you think it should be, it's a lot about learning to trust and respect that and say, okay, you feel full. And, here's the next time that we're going to eat. Right. And it's okay for you to get hungry before that time.
Yeah. Which kind of relates to the next point, which is trying not to comment on what your child is or isn't eating or the amount that they're eating. This creates a lot more pressure and stress around it. And it also cues them into the fact that you're really concerned about this, and it may make them less likely to try the new foods or finish what's on their plate. It's also important to recognize that mealtime is an important social opportunity for families. It's a time when we come back together, we talk about our day, it reinforces social bonds. And so when we're focusing so much on, what and how much is being eaten, we're losing that aspect of mealtime. Erin talked about this a little bit earlier, but avoiding juice, milk, other filling foods for snacks and right before meals, because your child does need to be hungry in order to try new foods. And being a role model by putting a variety on your plate. I think it's also important for families to remember that appetite can vary day to day and week to week, especially for toddlers. And food jags are also common. Food jags are when a child wants to eat only one particular food for every meal. Those can be tricky around mealtime, but if the food involved in the food jag that they're on is generally nutritious, you could offer that as their preferred food for that meal, but also having, the rest of the meal available for them to eat too. Dessert, everyone's favorite, right? But we need to avoid using dessert as a bargaining chip. I think that is so common. I think my parents even did it. But when we designate a food as a reward, or something that's bad, or something that's only given, contingent upon you finishing a certain food, it becomes more exciting, it becomes more desirable, it becomes an obsession. It's important for us to establish that there are no bad or good foods. Rather, some of them are eaten in moderation. Some of them make our body feel good, some of them help our body grow, and others are fun, and they're nice to eat as a treat. But that food is not a reward for eating other foods that help our body grow, right? If you do have a child who kind of does get fixated on the idea of dessert at the end of the meal and isn't able to move past that, you could also consider placing the appropriately portioned dessert in the middle of the table at the beginning of the meal. The dessert is part of the meal, right? So they can choose when they eat the dessert. It could be at the beginning of the meal, but then we still have dinner. So it doesn't become this reward or this treat at the end of the meal that I have to get to and distracts from eating the food that helps my body grow.
There may be some times where a program that you're in or a therapist that you're working with is using some highly preferred foods for your child as a reward, and that's fine. It's usually under a pretty controlled setting. Many of us have used M&Ms for potty training, or have used, getting a bite of a preferred food if you are trying a new food or doing something. So if this is being done, within the goals of your therapy, that's fine. We just want to avoid just using food as a reinforcer all the time, because it can just create some difficult habits to break over time.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about strategies for some of our kiddos who have some sensory eating difficulties. And if you think about it, eating can be a really overwhelming sensory experience. It's one of the only things that we do that really involves all 5 senses. And for a child, some children on the autism spectrum, some children who just have sensory processing differences, sometimes each of those sensory inputs can feel very intense and very overwhelming. And often this can look like kids who get overwhelmed or distracted or don't want to sit at the table. It can also come out in really strong preferences. So some kids get very attached to feeling safe or feeling comfortable with a certain texture, a certain flavor. Something's crunchy, something smooth, something salty or sweet or strong flavors. Some kids really prefer that. So it can be helpful, if we're thinking about this. We already talked a little bit about making a list of the foods that your kid eats, just to look at, how picky are they really? And if you do that, you can start to look for patterns. Does my child always seem to prefer foods that have a really uniform texture, or they really like things that are very crunchy? And so here's just some examples of some ways you can use that information to think about what new foods you might want to try to introduce to your child first. So if you know that your child has a strong preference for softer food and you want them to work on eating a different food, you might give them a smooth dip like a hummus rather than a roasted chickpea, which is going to be more of a crunchy food. If you want to work on fruit, you might give them something like a fruit smoothie or a fruit yogurt as opposed to a crunchy apple slice or a crunchy carrot stick. And so you can think about some of what your kids like and then start to try to expand to new or different options within that type of food. I really like this slide. It just made me. So when you look at why kids really like some of these prepackaged, prepared, very uniform foods and snack foods, they are very predictable. They do not make you anxious because you know exactly what that cracker is going to taste like every single time you eat it. Whereas there is a lot of variation in fruits and vegetables. And so you may need to think about that when you're preparing the food for the child. Is there a way that you can make it a little bit more predictable? Applesauce is going to taste more predictable in texture than an apple. So that may be helpful when you're thinking about why your child is hesitant to try some of these foods or eats it sometimes but not other times. It may taste very different. So this is what Cheyenne mentioned earlier, and it's an idea called food chaining that often nutritionists or therapists working with picky eaters will use. And the idea is that you take something that you know the kid likes, and then you take baby steps to get to a food that you would like them to try. To be honest, I'm not sure that going from potato chips to bananas is that easy of a jump. But if you have a kid who really likes, sweet things, it makes sense to try maybe granola bars or packaged snacks that are sweeter, and then try to introduce a different flavor, a different texture with the yogurt, with the granola, but you're still having chocolate, you're still having a sweet food, and still having some similar texture, and then move from that maybe to fruit or berries. And just use the idea of what you know your kid already likes and move slowly.
I'm wondering if there's some additional steps between the potato chip and the banana chip, but you get the idea.
The idea of, for the crunchy eaters, the idea of doing some freeze-dried food or dried fruit, I think is a good idea. And there's a lot of different things, crunchy snap peas and freeze-dried broccoli and carrots and different things like that. Or if your kid loves tater tots, there are, tater tots made with different vegetables. So you can introduce some things that are very similar, but maybe have a little bit different nutritional value.
Yeah, and I think that slide that we were on a little bit earlier, not only does it demonstrate, here are some, your child likes smooth foods, so here are some alternative options, but there are healthy alternatives to the crunchy, the crunchy chip seeker, right? So a crunchy garbanzo bean, if they like the taste of banana, the crunchy banana chips. So I like that slide, and that may give you some additional ideas on, there are some kind of healthy options that I can introduce to my kid who's only drinking Danimals or only eating Lay's potato chips.
Yeah, and might still feel more predictable and more like a snack to them.
Yeah.
So as we're thinking about introducing new foods, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if your child really has difficulty with introducing new foods, you hear all the time, just let them try it, 10 or 20 different times. Well, you may not even be able to get the kid to be anywhere near that food. So you might have to move a little bit slower than that. And that might mean tolerating the food being on the table. It might mean having a separate plate near your child's plate where you put a food that you want to expose them to, but you don't expect them to do anything other than tolerate it being on that plate. And then after that, you might ask them to poke it with a fork, to help serve some onto your plate, to interact with it in some way. And then you start moving towards smelling, touching, licking, tasting, and that way you get a little bit closer to the food without it being quite as stressful of an experience. And if you can do this in kind of a low pressure way, it definitely makes the kids more interested in doing it. So involving some sensory play with it is helpful.
So we're going to move on a little bit to talk about some strategies for your busy or distractible eaters. This might look like children who have ADHD, other developmental disabilities or disorders, hyperactivity, inattention. This may also look like a toddler, okay? So I think that the most important thing to mention first is have developmentally appropriate expectations for how long your child is able to sit for mealtime. And I use the term developmentally purposefully because your child with ADHD, their developmental ability to sit may look very different than their peers, okay? Toddlers, probably a good attention span is 5 to 10 minutes, right? So having appropriate expectations when you come into this and when you approach this. For your busy and distractible eaters and for your little guys, the clock starts when your child sits down at the table, okay? So having meals ready to go when you call your child to the table or when you put them in their high chair is important, because if they're waiting for you to finish with something in the oven or plate things, for example, their attention span is waning already. And in addition, there's nothing in front of them to keep them focused, and so we're already losing time, right? So having food ready to go when they come to the table allows you to maximize the time that they're focused on eating. If you still have a couple things to do and you notice your child getting a little bit restless, or you need to give them something to do, give them a job while you're preparing the food. Set the table, gather your siblings. This keeps them busy and focused while maintaining their attention on the fact that mealtime is coming up too, rather than, go watch television, because then we might have some transition challenges when it is finally time for dinner. Having consistent mealtime routines, we've said this a couple times. Again, limiting distractions during mealtime. If your child really does have a lot of difficulty sitting at the table, you can also consider working in a set number of breaks throughout the meal. And I think the key is that there's a set number of breaks. It's not unlimited. Maybe you get 3 breaks throughout the meal, but once you've taken those 3 breaks, mealtime is over, right? And it may take a little bit of time to develop the consistency of this routine, but it could be really helpful for those kids who just have a lot of difficulty sitting still. And for the kids who maybe in school, that would look like chunking their work or taking breaks during longer tasks. The same would go for mealtime. Okay.
All right, so that is the end of our presentation. We do have some resources and have some of the websites, and those will all be available to you guys as well. And we will share this, this presentation and the slides and resources for you. So if I can figure out how to do this, we're going to take a minute to look through some of the chat questions that have been going on. So that we can look at answering these.
What is the name of the book that you mentioned at the beginning?
So the best place to find the information that I talked about is really the website, and it's www.ellyn, ELLYN, institute.org. And that has a lot of different resources on it. There are also, she's written several different books, Feeding Your Child with Love and Good Sense, Secrets to Feeding a Healthy Family, Your Child's Weight, How to Help Without Hurting. So there's a number of different topics that may address specifically younger kids, older kids, kids with developmental differences, kids who are overweight versus underweight, and some of those different issues. So, and that website will be included in the notes as well. This is a really good question. So, someone says, I have 2 kids. One has developmental delays and is very small. We need to pump calories into her. She eats best when in front of a video. Our other daughter is robust and we have to watch her calorie intake. She often asks for more food than I think healthy. They have very different needs. How do we accommodate both? And that is a perfect question, and that's kind of exactly what we're talking about. The goal really is to let each of those kids control their own intake and see if you're able to take a step back and give them some trust. it's really difficult, some of the really little kids especially, who eat better when they're distracted or in front of a video. I would say just try not to make that every feeding opportunity. If you feel like you really need to get something in them at breakfast when they first wake up and that's how you do it, that's fine. But try to make sure you're having some eating opportunities throughout the day where you are asking her to sit at a table and to try eating a variety of different things. And it may take you feeling a little uncomfortable with your one child eating more than you think is reasonable and your other child eating less than you think is reasonable over time. But what we hope is that as kids feel safe and comfortable to eat as much or as little as their body is asking for, that they will continue to expand the foods that they're eating, and they won't either be nervous about eating because they're going to be asked to eat more than feels good for them, or feel like they need to sneak food or overeat because they're afraid that not enough food is going to be available.
I think also if there are real medical concerns and maybe like concerns about the child's growth and weight gain, and you really are having to look very carefully at the calories that they're consuming, but you have another child who is wanting to snack a lot and is wanting to eat more and maybe sees their sibling getting a lot to eat and they're seeking that as well. One thing that I would recommend is first discuss this with your pediatrician, discuss it with your feeding therapist or your SLP or your OT. But one way to kind of get in the extra calories for the child who needs more calories is sneaking more snacks in throughout the day. So kind of spreading those calories out throughout the day when maybe the other sibling is more distracted rather than loading calories at meal times. So that may be helpful too. A granola bar while she's watching television is not a big deal, but when we come to the dinner table, it's important to minimize distractions.
Yeah, and it really has been shown over time with kids that that you feel like are eating too much. It's easier to make that a bigger problem by trying to limit what they're eating. And it's easier to just kind of let them feel like they're eating enough and let their bodies, kind of hopefully adjust to that as they grow.
Okay. Okay.
What do you do when your child is distracted with everything on the table, including the food? She will play and not eat. So sometimes that happens when kids are not hungry enough. Often they are not feeling hungry when they sit at the table. And so they're playing with things or fidgeting with things. So one thing might be to try to limit the amount of food they're eating before that. The other thing might be offering just one or two foods on the plate at a time, making it a less distracting eating area, and just giving them as much as they can eat in a few minutes, and then if they eat that, add some more.
That could be helpful for kids who have a tendency to overstuff too, is limiting the amount of food that they have on their plate in front of them, and then as they finish that, offering more, right? There is a question about vitamins for very picky eaters. That's something that's a great question for your pediatrician, and a good question for their next well-child visit.
Okay, here's one more coming in. My 3-year-old does not like to eat in the morning. We have to leave for school at 8:10. He gets up between 6:30 and 7. He is autistic and has sensory issues. He has snack at 9:45 a.m. at school.
I wonder, would he drink a smoothie, or would he drink like an Ensure or a Pediasure? That's one option.
Another option is kind of trusting his body again and saying, I'm going to put food in front of you. I'm going to give you an opportunity to eat before school, and you have the choice to not eat. And if he doesn't eat, he may eat well at that snack at 9:45. That might be also, for some kids, they eat better earlier in the day. For some kids, they eat better later in the day. So you might want to give him a really good after-school snack. Or some kids, if they're really not eating well at dinner and you're worried about them being hungry at the end of the day, you can put in a bedtime snack. If that's something that works for your family and you're worried that they're not going to sleep because they didn't eat well, It's okay if he doesn't eat in the morning, as long as you're able to get those calories in throughout the day. This is another thing that comes up for our kiddos who might be on ADHD medications that affect their appetite. You need to look at what is the time of day where they're feeling hungry and kind of load the calories and the food at that point.
Right.
All right, and I think we will try to take time to answer about one more question. So sometimes my 5-year-old child eats very well while he is watching an iPad. He seems to think that eating is a good time to enjoy the screen time. Yes, we all feel that way sometimes. I tried to stop this, but there was a trade-off between eating and not watching an iPad. And what I might do to start with that is just not offer the iPad every single time he eats. So if you're looking at 3 meals and 2 snacks a day, you're looking at 5 eating opportunities. And can you do that slowly? Can you start with 1 or 2 of the eating opportunities not having the iPad available? And that way, if he doesn't eat as much at those times, he'll make up for it, you know, during the other times where you're letting him, you know, maybe be more distracted. And then as he gets better at sitting at the table for a few minutes or maybe eating during some of the meal times, you can start to decrease that more slowly.
Yeah.
Or you could even say, you know, you can watch your iPad for the first 10 minutes and then we're going to turn it off. Some of these things, if the ways that we described today look very, very different than the way you're currently eating in your house, you may have to change one thing at a time. You may just want to say, you know, just work on what are the times that food's available, but you can still eat on the couch in front of the TV if that's what you're used to. But instead of being all day long, it's at a set time.
Yeah.
And so you can take baby steps towards moving your family more in this direction over time.
And I think just like introducing too many new foods at once can be overwhelming, changing too many things around mealtime, changing too much of the routine or the expectations around mealtime can make that very overwhelming and may make your child much more resistant to kind of going along with those changes or trying new foods or eating everything that's in front of them.
And Matt has put the website over in the chat section as well, which is super helpful. And again, if people can't see that right now, it will be included in the notes that will be available to everyone. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope this was useful. And I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and go enjoy your dinner with your family.
All right, thanks, guys.